All right. Gonna stay there this time?
Do you want me to sit here to watch it?
Okay. All right, learning objectives. Remember to match them back to the beginning of the chapter. Okay, so our first 30 seconds then, ATP PC system. All right, 5 to 10 seconds of ATP, 15 or so, 20 seconds of phosphocreatine. Then we've got about 2.5 minutes worth of glycolysis breaking down carbohydrate, gets us to about 3 minutes. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is if we keep moving for longer than 3 minutes, now how do we produce our ATP for muscle contraction? All right? So, our fats get broken down. The process of breaking down fats is called beta oxidation. This is the thing that doesn't produce ATP. Okay? But beta oxidation is the equivalent of glycolysis, but for a fat molecule rather than a carbohydrate molecule. Okay? And they get broken down to acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA is the molecule that feeds into the aerobic metabolic pathway. So aerobic metabolism has two components to it, unlike the anaerobic systems that have really one part. The aerobic metabolism, part 1 is Krebs cycle. Part 2 is the electron transport chain. Okay. Aerobic metabolism occurs within the mitochondria of the muscle cell. Anaerobic metabolism occurs within the sarcoplasm, within the kind of jelly, watery substance of the cell. So when we have our pyruvate, and I was saying the other day that the pyruvate gets shuttled across somewhere else in the cell, it gets shuttled over towards the mitochondria. Okay. And our bus system, NAD and FAD, that pick up the hydrogen ions, they also then transport those hydrogen ions to the mitochondria. Right? The mitochondria is the place in the cell where the majority of ATP is formed. Right? If you think back to our system 1, we're not producing very much ATP because it can only last for 25-30 seconds. When we look at glycolysis, we don't get very much ATP for a molecule of carbohydrate. Right? So during that first 3 minutes, we're not making vast amounts of ATP. It's not until we get into aerobic metabolism that we really see ATP production kick into gear. So there's some major benefits to aerobic metabolism, right? Even though it takes a lot longer to get ATP from aerobic metabolism, so it's no good if I suddenly have to jump up and run out of the building, it doesn't produce this big change in pH within the environment. So that means that we don't see very much fatigue within the system. Right? It can keep making ATP for a very long time. So think about how long, if you go hiking at the weekends, How long can you hike for? Hours. 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 So I don't see fatigue in this system in the same way that I do in system 2. It's a more efficient use of carbohydrate than glycolysis is, even though it's slower. And we've got this ability to also use fat stores, which we have plenty of, even if we're lean. All right? The other big benefit is that the waste products of aerobic metabolism are just water and carbon dioxide, which are very easily managed within the body, right? We can get rid of water either by sweating or by urinating, right? It's really easy to get water out of the body, and carbon dioxide gets passed into the bloodstream, circled round to the lungs, and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So both of the waste products here don't have any effect, they're not causing any toxicity, there's no change in pH, it's really simple to deal with, right? So we've got a long-term system that can produce energy for us without any back pain, right? I don't have any backlash from that.
Where are you going? You going out there? Huh? Where are you going?
So, part 1 of aerobic metabolism is Krebs cycle. And just as I did with glycolysis, I'm going to give you a simpler version. If you want the tricky version, it's in the book, right? Krebs cycle involves many breakdowns of the molecule. Okay. Each one has a very long name. Each one has an accompanying enzyme. Okay. But for our purposes as teachers, we don't need to know every step of the cycle. We need to know the main points about the cycle and when we're going to be using aerobic metabolism. Okay? So, our cycle. So acetyl-CoA is the common denominator. Doesn't matter which substrate we're going to use. Okay? Once we have acetyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA can feed into Krebs cycle. Okay? Now, remember the carbon issue? Number of carbons in the molecule, all right? My glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. My pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. Acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon molecule. So when pyruvate gets turned into acetyl-CoA, we lose a carbon. That means that for every 1 molecule of carbohydrate, I get 2 acetyl-CoAs. Does that make sense? Right? Because 1 piece of glucose goes into glycolysis, I get 2 pieces of pyruvate, and therefore I get 2 pieces of acetyl-CoA. Right? Remember when we looked at the diagram of the fat molecule, how many carbons there were? So there could be 18, there could be 26. So for any fat molecule that gets broken down, I get many, many more acetyl-CoAs than I do from a carbohydrate molecule. Right? And that's why fats are such a great source of energy, because they've got all this carbon in them, and they've got lots of energy bonds and carbons that we can feed into Krebs cycle. Right. So, that's pretty simple, huh? we get one piece of ATP per Krebs cycle. And we get hydrogen, there's another one, get at least, oh, there's another one down here. We maybe get at least 4. Doesn't matter the number of hydrogens, we get hydrogen, okay? The hydrogens in Krebs cycle also get picked up by the bus system. All right, so these hydrogens are going to get picked up by NAD or FAD, and they're going to get shuttled to the electron transport chain. So I said that the mitochondria is the place within the muscle cell where the most amount of ATP gets formed, right? Except it's not happening in Krebs cycle because we only get 1 ATP per cycle, okay? So Krebs cycle still is not the place where we're producing tons and tons of ATP, all right? That happens in the electron transport chain, part 2 of aerobic metabolism. The electron transport chain is often pictured like a waterfall. And what happens here is that the NAD and the FAD that are carrying the hydrogen ions, doesn't matter whether that hydrogen came from Krebs cycle or, remember, whether the hydrogen came from glycolysis. Right? They're responsible for busing that hydrogen to the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. Okay. The hydrogen ion gets dropped off at the top if the bus was NAD. It gets dropped off a little bit lower on the chain if the bus was FAD. That's not hugely important, but it does explain one of the anomalies we'll see later on. All right? Think of FAD as the bus that's running out of petrol, out of gas, or the bus that's old, can't quite make it to the top of the hill to drop the passengers off. Okay? Now, the complicated version of electron transport chain is that what actually happens is we drop the electron off, and it's the electron that moves through the chain. Don't worry about it. It's, bless you, it's too complicated. Bless you. Just think about hydrogen moving through the electron transport chain. And as it moves through the electron transport chain, passes down through the chain, we get tons and tons of ATP. Right? Loads and loads of it. Okay. So if we go back to our carbs versus our fats idea, right? If I am using carbohydrate aerobically, I only get 2 acetyl-CoAs per glucose molecule, right? So I only get 2 cycles of Krebs. I get a little bit of hydrogen that gets fed over here. But if I'm using fat, and I've got, I don't know, let's say 8 acetyl-CoAs, right? Then I've got 8 cycles, I've got a lot more hydrogen coming across to the electron transport chain and creating ATP. So in the electron transport chain, I've got lots and lots of ATP being made that I can then break down, get at that third energy bond for muscle contraction. So we have a problem now, right? Because I get to the bottom of the electron transport chain, I've created all this ATP, and I spew out hydrogen ions. And these hydrogen ions are still acidic, right? So it's like, well, wait a minute, we've created all this ATP, but we haven't fixed the environmental pH problem. But we also haven't talked about oxygen yet, right? So this is where oxygen comes into the picture. If I have enough oxygen in the cell, oxygen is going to pick up my hydrogen, and what am I going to get? Right? Simple. So as long as I have oxygen here to pick up these hydrogen ions that are coming out of the electron transport chain, I never see a change in pH. That means I don't get any fatigue in this system. And the way that this book tackles this, we go backwards up the chain. So the next chapter is going to tell us how we got oxygen into the cell. But for now, in order for aerobic metabolism to work, there has to be oxygen available at the bottom of the chain to collect these hydrogen ions and to keep the pH level. So we said this system takes over at about 3 minutes as the predominance, not that it isn't chugging away underneath, but when it becomes the predominant maker of ATP for your muscle contraction is around 3 minutes and longer. Right? So that suggests then that it's taking 2.5 to 3 minutes. You think about what happens when you start to move, right? You automatically start breathing a little bit more heavily. But that oxygen doesn't suddenly appear within the muscle cell. It's got its own little journey it has to go on to get to the muscle cell so that we can do this, which is why we need system 1 and 2 to fill in the gap. Right? Because just because I start breathing more deeply doesn't mean that oxygen is in the muscle cell. So I have to have system 1 and 2 to get me over the amount of time it takes to get oxygen moving around the body and being delivered into the cell. Blimey, I was that good. Jeez. Austin's going, yeah. You just have to keep practicing it. I mean, we'll talk about it a lot. We're going to do, not this Thursday, but next Thursday, we'll do a little activity in lab. We can review it again on the review session before the exam. One of the things I learned to do later, not when I was your age, because I failed a lot of exams when I was your age, but one of the things I learned to do was to when I study, is to make myself bullet lists or flow charts or diagrams, right? And then the very first thing I do when I walk into the exam is draw my bullet list, draw my flow charts, and draw my diagrams before I read the exam. So that everything I've tried to cram in there, I get down on paper as quickly as I can, and then I start reading questions. Right? Because if you start reading the questions, the automatic response is, and once you do that, memory shuts down. Right? So you've got to use some other strategies there. And I always leave big margins. Sometimes there's a blank sheet on the back of the exam. If there isn't a blank sheet, I will give you scrap paper so you can draw those for yourselves, so that you've got that info there. If that works for you, right? For some people that won't work. But
so we don't need to know like the oxidative phosphorylation or anything specific like that, or just need to know what it is?
this is as much detail as you need. I mean, this whole system 3 is called oxidative phosphorylation. That's the fancy term. Is it dying?
No, it just wasn't on the. It wasn't on the diagram.
All right, and we have to remember, although we can use protein as an energy system, as an energy source, right? Because we can break protein down into acetyl-CoA. So if necessary, we can access the energy in protein for aerobic metabolism. It's just that typically, as humans, we don't use protein for energy very much. Right? There are a couple of circumstances when we use it more often. So one is if we're on some silly diet and we've got a really big cut in our calorie intake, right? Then one of the things the body might do is access protein from muscle and use it for energy. So it's another reason why if you're dieting, you need to also be exercising, because otherwise some of the weight you lose will be muscle mass, and that isn't beneficial. Right? Another situation, and this is one of the physiological arguments that the people that are selling you keto diets and things will use, is that if you eat a lot of protein, your body will adapt to using more protein for energy. Right? That is true. It still doesn't, I mean, it's not like you're going to use 100% protein for energy. Right? It's still a tiny amount. So. Do you want me to go over it again? Are you okay? Remember, we've got the review session, so, you know, if you want me to, or come see me in my office hours and we can run through it again. Right? Oh, that's the fancy version of an electron transport chain. Okay, so these two tables are in your chapter. I just wanted to highlight because they give you some of the reason why aerobic work is good for using fats. Right? if we break down carbohydrate, glucose or glycogen, then we end up with 32, 33 molecules of ATP in the end. Aerobic, right? We're talking aerobic breakdown. So we break it down via glycolysis, we get to our pyruvate, we shuttle the pyruvate to the mitochondria, we turn it into acetyl-CoA, and then we use the acetyl-CoA in Krebs cycle in the electron transport chain. Right, so we get somewhere around 32, 33. That number has changed since I was your age. It was 30. I suspect it will change again. All right? So the number is not the important thing. The important thing is it's not very much. Right? So if glucose use is high, or if I go a long time in between meals and my blood glucose levels are quite low, then the liver will start to break down its glycogen store and dump some more glucose into the bloodstream. So that liver is like the backup pantry. Right? When our blood glucose levels are very high, so if I have a humongous big plate of pasta or rice, or I have a great big jacket potato, right? I've got lots of carbs in the meal that I'm eating, then the liver and the muscle and the brain will remove glucose from the bloodstream and use it for energy or for storage. Now the brain doesn't store carbohydrate, but it does use carbohydrate exclusively as an energy source. Another problem with low-carb diets. Because this is a little bit important, really. I need it working properly, right? I don't need it hungry.
So when does your body use fats to convert into energy instead of
carbs? So we'll get to that, but I'll answer your question and then we'll get a reminder later on, right? It takes about 20 minutes of continual movement for your body to switch from predominantly carbohydrate to predominantly fat. Except that this is predominantly fat, right? Because although you're not moving, it is low intensity continual muscle contraction, right? But you don't use very much energy sitting down. So although fat is the predominant source right now for you, you're not using stored fat very much.
So nutritionally, there's really nothing you can do to get your body to convert to fat instead of carbs. Does that make sense?
I mean, you want to decrease fat content within your diet, not cut it out. We'll talk about decreasing it. And then you just have to move. The only thing you can do, right, is that energy balance. So even if I don't move, remember the majority of the energy that I use during the day is metabolic rate, keeping everything working. So even if I don't move, there's a level of calories that are necessary to keep my body working. So I can decrease that calorie intake, and I should lose some fat under that circumstance. But it's not a very healthy way to do it, because you'll also lose muscle mass, you'll become dehydrated, there's all kinds of negatives involved in doing it that way. So I can eat only 1,000 calories a day. I did it when I was a teenager, right? And landed on my head many times in the gym. So I can eat 1,000 calories a day, and I may or may not lose weight because ultimately what happens is your body goes, well, this isn't right. There's something going on here. I need more calories than this. So I'm going to decrease my metabolic rate so I don't need so many calories. And then you don't lose weight because it just shifts the scale. Okay? Okay. So let's have a quick look at carbs. So 32, 33 is the current number. The 32 or 33 relies somewhat upon whether that hydrogen is picked up by NAD or FAD, as well as whether it was glucose or glycogen, right? Not very much. If I take a 16 carbon fatty acid, which is a relatively small fatty acid, right? I get 106 ATPs versus 32. So again, the number is less important than the idea that one molecule of fat has the potential to produce much more ATP than one molecule of carbohydrate. One molecule of glucose in particular, right? But even glycogen doesn't produce much. The bigger the fatty acid is, the more ATP there's going to be, because the more carbon there is, and therefore the more acetyl-CoAs I get. Right? So if it's a 26 carbon fatty acid, I'm going to get more ATP from that than I do from a 16 carbon fatty acid. If the numbers help you delineate the difference, great. If the numbers make it confusing, don't remember them. Fats produce lots, carbs produce a little. Right? The usefulness of carbohydrate is the fact that it's such a small molecule, I can break it down quickly to make ATP. Not that it produces a lot of ATP. Right? It's the speed at which I can access the energy bonds that makes it useful.
So the body won't start using the fatty acid at all until a certain amount of time, or will it somewhat, and then after a certain amount of time it really starts to change over to that?
Like it's using it now,
Yeah, but it's just really minimal.
but it's minimal.
Yeah, and then it's
So if you get up and you walk across the bridge, you're going to switch to using carbohydrate because that's a big change in intensity.
Yeah.
But that fat will still be chugging along underneath. It's not doing very much use though, until you get to that 20-minute window.
and then it sort of changes to the more common.
Yeah.
Which is why endurance athletes are more lean.
Yeah. It's why, since we're having this conversation, it's why when you write prescriptions for someone or you're trying to help someone who wants to lose fat mass, it's important to get the intensity correct on the program. Because if I am working really hard, what substance am I using? Carbs. Right? And this is a big problem for people who don't know what they're doing, right? They think, oh God, I'm overweight, I wanna lose weight, I'll go to the gym and I'll work out really, really, really hard, and they work out really hard for 4 to 6 weeks, and not very much has happened. And they get demotivated. Right? Because working out really, really hard doesn't access fat stores. So there's a time window and there's an intensity window that we have to put together when we're looking at setting a program to lose fat mass.
So how does it work if you're trying to gain muscle?
Ooh, that's difficult. Not very much you don't want to do much aerobics. Yeah, gaining muscle is hard. You gotta train the right resistance program for hypertrophy. You have to not do very much aerobic work. You want to sleep a lot, and you have to eat a lot, spread out across the day.
Is there a certain diet, or do you usually put it?
No, I mean, you would want to have a little bit more protein than a normal person. And again, we'll talk more about this, but so for strength athletes, they recommend around 1.7, 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. You don't want to increase it much more than that, because at 2 grams you're risking kidney damage. So it's another problem with keto. We'll do some games with some diets later on. Sleep is key. When I worked in a bodybuilding gym in Manhattan for a while. And those guys eat and sleep all day. That's what they do. Train, eat, sleep. Train, eat, sleep in these blocks. Right? And at the time, because it was quite a long time ago, the kind of shakes and protein drinks and Gatorades and all these things weren't available. Their gym bags were full of baby food. And they would just open a jar of baby food, slop it down. At least 10 hours sleep a night, plus a snooze in the afternoon.
I do.
Wow.
Lots of sleep. Takes lots of sleep to build muscle tissue.
Getting gains.
What else? What other little gems can I tell you? Yeah, now sleep, food, train right. It's not easy. Putting on muscle mass is very difficult for most people. And again, it's a little bit like fat loss. Like, you know, you want to lose this, and you train like crazy, and what you lose is this, and this is still sitting there. I'm like, well, that wasn't the plan, right? And that wasn't what I wanted. Right? It's a little bit like that with muscle mass, although you can be a little more specific about the muscles that you're training. And you have to train them in the right way so that you do enough damage to the muscle tissue to stimulate protein synthesis within that muscle tissue, but not so much that then you can't train the next day as well. I mean, it's tricky. It's a science. Science. Movement is science. Don't let anybody tell you any different. You go, oh, you're just a movement person? I'm a scientist. Okay?
Got a whole new respect for the for Schwarzenegger.
Oh, yeah. And you do, I mean, you know, they cheat, right? They use testosterone and growth hormone. But that doesn't mean that they don't put the work in. It just means that they give themselves an advantage. But you can't take testosterone and growth hormone and just lie there and grow big muscles. That's not how it works, right? You still got to work your buns off to get the response from taking the drug. So, enough info for today, I think. Okay, on Friday we'll do a little bit more. Monday we will finish off. Wednesday will be the review session. Friday will be the exam.
Do we need to bring a Scantron?
No, no.
Is there another?
Sorry?
What is the formula?
So the exam, multiple choice, short answer, fill in the blank, very applied.
And
So the applied is the bit that usually catches people out because they rote learn things instead of learning the concept.
Is there another chapter covered for the exam?
No.
Just 1 through 3?
That's why there's 5 exams, because I try to keep it relatively
3 chapters.
a small amount of information for each exam so that you don't get overwhelmed with it, because it is
That's a lot.
tricky.
It's a lot. It's like,
Yeah.
when you're saying it, it's easy to sort of be like, yeah, I understand. And then when you go away for a day, you know, I think about that kind of thing.
Yes.
Well, it's funny, because all of us in AP2, it's like, you're talking about this, and the next day in AP2, we're almost talking about the exact same thing.
How you turn it off?
Except it's more complicated in A&P too.
He just needs to learn from you. What needs to happen.
Well, no, he's preparing you for a different job, right? So his job is different to mine.
It's really funny to me to take this class.
You can do potential budget.
She eats like 600 calories a day. And I go home and it's like, there's no way.
That's right. She probably might lose much weight.
She's like, hours a day, you gain 200 calories.
Oh, for chapter 3? Yeah, I'll go in and correct it. Normally what happens is you'll have a capital letter on the answer, and black one is just a so you put a capital letter and it doesn't match what I put in the answer, so it says you got it. Or you've got a typo. Yeah, I'll go in and correct it.
Because you're supposed to have
You gotta make sure a minor, so she.
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna do.
That